Thank you all for joining us today for this faculty forum. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Robert Perdue. He's an associate professor here at Virginia Tech in the Department of Sociology. His work focuses on environmental crimes, environmental injustice, and with special emphasis on mass incarceration and natural resource extraction. So without further ado, Dr. Perdue.
Good morning. Well, I was hoping to be in person, but I've been struck by a little cold here, so I'm going to try and not contaminate anyone else. But thank you, Shane, and thank you, Brad, and thanks to the CCC for inviting me to talk with you all today. I'm kind of gearing this talk for students, and one of the primary interests of mine is to show you some of my path of research and how it kind of unfolds and evolves over time. So let me share with you my screen. I think that's it. Oh, let's see this one. Okay. And so, yeah, the title of the paper is Trashing Appalachia, but we're going to be talking a little bit more, going a little bit broader than just Appalachia today. So again, thanks for having me. So I want to kind of take you back to the beginnings of my research journey, and we'll just go over this briefly because I think most of you recognize this as a mountaintop removal coal mining site, and this is a methodology of extraction that the coal industry has really adopted in the last probably 3 decades. Before this, most coal was mined underground. A lot of that changed in the 1950s with technologies, but we don't really need to go too far into that. But this is really what drew me to the region. I'm from the region, but I was interested in these ecological impacts and the community level impacts. So you see that, if you have a, coal has been mined in Appalachia for a couple hundred years. So most of the easily accessible coal seams have been mined out long ago. So if you have a apple tree in your backyard and you want to pick the apples, you're going to pick the apples that you can just reach, right? You're not going to pick a 20-foot ladder and go and pick the apples at the very top of the tree first. So all the easily accessible coal has been long mined. So to get to this coal, the tops of these mountains would be bulldozed and leveled, the ecosystems pushed off, and big drills would come and drill down up to 500 to 700 feet, and explosives would be ignited to blow up the top of the mountain. And you can see here, this former ecosystem is what the industry calls valley fill. This is what they also call overburden. So they're pushing overburden is what most of us would call an ecosystem. They call it overburden. They push it aside. And this right here, oftentimes there's families and houses and communities in these areas where the valley fills are pushed down, and that can decimate their water quality, their wells, and shake their foundations, bury streams, obviously get rid of all of the entire ecosystem. So it was something I was very interested in. And just to give you a size of the scale, this machine is like about as big as a skyscraper. That's what's called a drag line. These machines here can scoop up 300 tons of material in one scoop. So this is a whole ecosystem that is decimated. So I was really interested in exploring this and the resistance to this ecologically devastating practice. So I began work with my dissertation on the groups that were opposed to strip mining and trying to stop strip mining in the region. And what I was really interested in is how diverse groups could come together for a common cause. So that, groups with different identities, different perspectives work together. So for instance, how can radical anarchist, environmental groups work with a local evangelical group? So I did some network analysis, lots of interviews, and spent a lot of time in the region. At the same time, I was also looking at the socioeconomic impacts of the coal industry more broadly. The main question was, is coal mining actually beneficial for local economies? right? The narrative has long been that, we can't survive without coal. Coal keeps the lights on. Coal provides all these jobs. So I just wanted to just interrogate that assumption. This is in 2012, so I'm old, so this has been a while. But I decided to study West Virginia with a colleague, and one of the um, really interesting things about West Virginia is that it was something of a perfect natural experiment, because in West Virginia, about half of the counties um, mine coal, right? West Virginia is the leading extractor of coal on the East Coast, but only about half of the counties actually extracted coal. And of that half, about half um, surface mining was predominant, and in about half, underground mining was predominant. So my hypothesis was that the counties that um, relied on surface mining, strip mining, mountaintop removal, they would have worse impacts, economic impacts on the communities. They wouldn't be helping those communities as much because surface mining requires a lot less labor. So I thought there'd be less money coming into the communities. What was interesting about this study, and I use the metaphor of addiction, right? This high you get when this industry comes in and is doing adding development to a region, but it's short-lived, right? The high wears off, and you become addicted to this industry that might not necessarily be in your best interest. So the main finding was that it didn't matter whether you strip mined or you relied on underground mining. The counties that didn't mine coal were better off than the counties that mined coal, regardless of their method of extraction. So we're getting to the point now in my research where I'm thinking, okay, well, we've got these terrible impacts of mountaintop removal on the ecosystems. We're not benefiting local communities with economic benefit, right? Some people would argue, well, we got to tear these mountains down because it's useful for the economy. That's our lifeblood. But in reality, it's not actually beneficial. So that's where I'm at now. And so when I was doing my research, I started noticing that the coal fields were becoming prison fields. I was really, surprised that I would always see these prisons all over the place in the region. So this is Red Onion State Prison in far southwest Virginia. It's built directly on a former strip mine, a former mountaintop removal site. It's a maximum security prison. It was built in 1998, I think, and it houses about 800 incarcerated people. Here's Wallens Ridge. This is another prison that was built directly on a former strip mine. You can still see the strip mine's pretty fresh there. The same floor plan as Red Onion. It's a little bit bigger. It's a maximum security prison as well. So you can see kind of my thinking. I like to, just, kind of unpack whether these assumptions about economic development are actually correct or not, and then go forward with that argument. If it's not, then I think that is an argument that policymakers actually listen to, right? The language of policymakers is finances and economics and money. I don't know what that is. Oh, so let's talk a little bit more about what was going on, why there's so much demand for prisons. So I think this is a really compelling quote. In the 90s, 245 prisons were built, with a prison opening somewhere in rural America every 15 days. I'm going to move this so I can read my screen here. Yeah, so this is really stunning, right? So why are we having all these prisons? Well, we have a supply, right? We have this growing supply of incarcerated folks. And this is a huge jump in the 80s and 90s. And so where were these new prisons being built? They were being built in four primary regions: West Texas, South Central Georgia, the Mississippi Delta, and Central Appalachia. So if you know anything about these regions, these are areas that are economically depressed and racially marginalized. So we have this rapidly growing prison population and this growth in prisons in rural areas. So historically, prisons have been built in urban areas. So this is a dramatic shift, right? Most folks live in urban areas, so that's where the prisons have been built historically. But in the 90s, we see this dramatically shifting to rural areas. So when I'm working on my research here around this time, around 2014, 15, 16, this is really the peak of the U.S. Prison population boom. As you can see, we were flat mainly throughout our history up until 72-ish area. And obviously, most of you know that's when Nixon declared his war on drugs. So some other reasons why we see this increase in our incarceration is that there was a push, especially from the right, to limit the discretion of justices and judges. So the Sentencing Reform Act of 1984 was very important in this. Truth in sentencing requires that folks that have a sentence are required to serve 85% of that sentence. The state of Virginia got rid of parole. We have mandatory minimums. We have the 3 strikes, which we're all familiar with, where 3 felonies would essentially land you in jail for the rest of your life. And all of this goes hand in hand with the war on drugs. So we have this huge prison population boom in the 80s and 90s. We have to have more prisons. And so most of those prisons are ending up in depressed rural regions. So my interest obviously is in Central Appalachia. But here's a couple of quotes. So historically, prisons have been deemed Lulus, locally undesirable or locally unwanted land uses. And this dramatically changed around this time. Students are praying that a prison would open in their neighborhood, right? These communities are begging for prisons because they think that prisons are going to bring them economic development. They think that prisons are going to be an economic panacea, so to speak. So prisons were no longer seen as these Lulus, these unwanted spaces. They are actually now being hoped for, and local policymakers would give these incentives to bring in prisons to their area. They would give tax incentives and free land and things of that nature. So my question was, are these, like the Cole study, are these prisons actually benefiting local communities? So are prisons an economic boon for the communities that house them? And this led to a paper in 2016 that I published in the Journal of Appalachian Studies. So what we did was we looked at 25 years of data. During this time, 29 prisons were built in Appalachia and Central Appalachia during that time. We did some fixed effects regression models, which essentially compares counties to themselves. So we're not comparing apples to oranges. We're holding a lot of things constant within a community, a county, and asking how did things change after that prison was brought in. So we looked at per capita income, poverty, and unemployment. And so the long and short of this, I don't want to bother you with the quantitative details, but prisons are not economic panaceas in Appalachia. In Appalachia, what we found were that prison counties had lower per capita income, prison counties had higher poverty, but the last finding was the one that made me hesitate in my overall finding, is that prison counties have lower unemployment. So that's a kind of a double negative. So what that means is that prison counties had better rates of employment. So you've got these kind of contrary findings. You've got prisons, counties have worse outcomes with income and poverty, but they have better outcomes with employment. So then I had to wrestle with that. How do I make sense of that? Well, the long and short of it, the idea that I derived was that these must be some pretty shitty jobs, right? So if you're having worse outcomes with income and poverty, these jobs that are coming in aren't actually helping folks. You have more jobs, but they're not good jobs because they're not paying the bills, so to speak. And a lot of this is due to the fact that when prisons come into an area, a lot of the jobs go to folks from outside of the region. These folks that are used to, that are experienced in the industry, a lot of these jobs are unionized. A lot of folks in the area don't have the education or the training to get these jobs. And quite frankly, a lot of folks might not be able to pass a drug test. So a lot of these jobs aren't going to locals. They're going to folks from outside of the area. So again, like my study with the coal mining, coal's not helping the communities, and neither are prisons. So that's kind of the baseline of where I started, and just trying to assess whether there's an economic argument to be made for prisons. in the area. And if you all have any questions or comments along the way, just jump in, please. Give me a chance to blow my nose. So after this study, I wrote a paper called Linking Environmental and Criminal Injustice. And so I'm really trying to, map on environmental injustices with criminal injustices at this time. And this is kind of the beginnings of this kind of environmental justice application to prisons. It hadn't, prisons were one of the last areas that environmental justice scholars had really tackled. Environmental justice scholars have been building a really robust canon for the last 30 years, looking at disproportionate burdens that people of color and the working classes carry compared to middle class and whiter folks. But prisons was one of the last areas that had kind of been neglected. So in this paper, I really wanted to unpack the whole history of mass incarceration first, and start to link that with the degraded environments and struggling communities. And so in that paper, I went back and started examining the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and Black codes. So as you all know, following the Civil War, there was a real crisis for a lot of folks that had been living well off the backs of enslaved folks. So this need for labor not only impacted the South that needed this agricultural workforce, but also the North. That was the financial drivers. A lot of the banks and the financial industries were supporting these plantations and agriculture economies in the South. And so because of that, they decided that they would still be able to get this in essence, enslaved workforce, but through the criminal justice system. So as you know, the 13th Amendment allows for slavery in the case of incarcerated folks. We have the 14th Amendment that gave a lot of power to corporations. And then we have Black codes that criminalized previously penalized behavior like loitering and vagrancy. And this was a means to incarcerate folks to then use them for their labor power. For instance, in Mississippi, following the Civil War, if you were a Black male, you were required by law to register with a plantation or some type of agricultural business on January 1st of every year, or you could be arrested and sent to work as an incarcerated citizen. I also wanted to go back and look at the role of corporations, the coal industry, in creating the kind of ecosystem that has led to some of these negative outcomes we see today. So if you haven't taken an Appalachian Studies course, do so, and you'll hear a lot of really interesting and tragic things about the history of Appalachia. The folks that were working in these coal camps had very few rights. Legally, the relationship between the employer and the employee was actually that technically legally of a master slave. And coal companies were very adamant about preventing unionization. That was their great fear. So they had a mine guard system, basically it was a police state on these coal camps to prevent folks from unionizing. Mail was monitored. Even the religion that was preached on Sundays was through the coal industry, and they would preach a very fatalistic religion that said, if your loved one died in a mine collapse, then that was God's will. And so it was a very exploitative environment for these folks. So I wanted to trace back and look at that history to see how we've kind of this history of exploitation carries forward from a couple hundred years. And then more recently, I published a piece called Trashing Appalachia. And in this piece, I wanted to get more into the theoretical issues here at the nexus of incarceration, ecological degradation, and race. So here's a quote from me. Using the conceptual lens of trash, I contend that the literal trashing of the ecosystems of this region has been fostered by the metaphorical representation of Appalachians as white trash. In turn, the space is now viewed as a logical location for the deposition of societal cast-offs in the form of prisoners. So this is more of a step back and saying, why do we think it's okay to destroy entire ecosystems, and when that economy collapses, then to bring in societal cast-offs in the form of prisoners. And one of the tools I use here is this idea of Appalachia as a regional discursive formation. This goes back to Foucault. A lot of geographers and anthropologists really embrace this idea of a regional discursive formation. And most simply, it's a way of casting stereotypes upon a whole region and all the inhabitants of that region. So here's Pete and Watts. They say that a discursive formation is modes of thought, logics, themes, styles of expression, and typical metaphors that run through the discursive history of a region. So in Appalachia, this discursive formation is based in stereotypes of uneducated people, of violent people, of addicted people, and therefore these stereotypes allow for this exploitation of the region in the broader national discourse. What's the big deal of exploiting this region? Those people are less than anyway. It ties back to ideas of Said and othering. And I also pulled ideas from Cedric Thompson and his idea of racial capitalism. And one thing that environmental justice scholars, for all the wonderful things that they've done, is that they've taken a very binary approach to race, and haven't really dug into some of the history of whiteness. And so Cedric Thompson adds some context here. He says that, European civilization through capitalism, the influence of capitalism was not to homogenize the white race, but to exaggerate regional, subcultural, and dialectical differences into racial ones. So he really helped me understand this idea that whiteness is not monolithic. Here's another long quote from me. Yeah, not unexpected when one identifies this space as a sacrifice zone, one where ecosystems are destroyed in quest for profits and energy independence. Coupled with the denigrated status of Appalachian in the broader American discourse, it becomes only too logical for this place to become a dumping site for societal cast-offs. And so this is what I was getting at when I was talking about the environmental justice scholars have not quite employed that variegated approach to race. And McDermott and Sampson have a really interesting quote here in saying that white privilege is not monolithic, that folks that are poor, gay, or otherwise marginalized don't experience that direct payoff. And so these are some of the arguments that I'm pulling in into this Trashing Appalachia piece. So now I want to talk a little bit about how I've expanded my scope recently away from focusing solely on Appalachia to take a more national perspective. So most studies that have looked at environmental justice concerns and incarceration have focused on case studies. And this is very useful because there are numerous examples of prisons being built on former coal mines or next to uranium mining and milling facilities. Rikers Island with methane leaks and things of this nature. So these case studies are really compelling. But what's been lacking is a nationwide analysis, moving beyond the case study to see, are there patterns and trends at the national level that show that prisons are typically sited in contaminated and polluted environments? So this is a recent paper that we just put out with a colleague, Pierce Greenberg. So we do that. We do that work and move beyond the case studies to try and see if there are national level patterns. So yeah, there's a pat on the back there. First nationwide quantitative analysis. Oh, it's coming out crazy. So what we found was that closer proximity to a prison is associated with higher levels of pollution across all measures of environmental harm. So let me see. Did I have I might, there we go. I thought I skipped something. So what we did was we looked at the census tract containing every incarceration facility in the United States. So this is state prisons, federal prisons, and county jails. So it was a lot of them, right? So we're looking at, so there's the numbers. If you're not familiar with the breakdown of how we incarcerate folks in the United States, most folks are not in federal prisons. Most folks that are incarcerated are actually in county jails. And so we correlated all these census tracts, and we use census tracts because in most of these correlations in environmental justice, or I won't say most, but oftentimes the unit of analysis is too big, really, to understand how a toxin can impact human health. So when we're looking at a lot of studies have used things like zip codes. So it's really hard to know exactly how a environmental contaminant or hazard will affect human health at this large scale, this large geographic scale. Maybe the facilities on one side of the zip code and people are on the other. We don't really know those direct impacts. So we tried to narrow down to zoom in on this smaller level, the census tract. And we pulled from EPA data, the RSEI and the TSDF. And my colleague, who's much smarter than me, did some really fancy statistical work and GIS work. And so then now let's get back to the findings. So what we found is that closer proximity to a prison is associated with higher levels of pollution across all measures of environmental harm. So when we looked at all of these EPA data, regardless of what the data, what indicator, whether it's air or water or whatnot, they're all associated with prison siting. We actually found, which was kind of surprising, we hadn't really thought of this, is that the most polluted sites for incarcerated folks were actually county jails. And when you think about it, that makes sense because most federal prisons are pretty far out of the cut. You know, they're pretty isolated. And county jails typically are in county seats with a lot of and these county seats typically have more industry, so more air pollution and water quality problems there. And then so the final finding there is your classic environmental justice finding is that census tracts with higher percentage of residents of color and residents in poverty were strongly and significantly correlated with measures of environmental hazards. So this is kind of the classic finding that people of color and people in poverty are more likely to be in hazardous, contaminated environments. All right, so I have one more study I want to talk to you about. So recently I published a piece, a book chapter, and this environmental justice and incarceration subfield is really growing in the last, say, 10 years, probably even less, probably like 6 or 7 years. But one area that hasn't been examined in detail are the folks that are detained in immigration and custom enforcement centers. So in this paper, I looked at the kind of the same approach and was asking, are folks that are incarcerated in these ICE detention centers, are they being exposed to environmental contaminants from their stays there? So again, this is the first nationwide quantitative analysis to correlate these environmental indicators with prison locations. I looked at federal prisons, but also federal ICE facilities. So what I did was I kind of merged the location of each of these 258 federal prisons and 130 federal immigration detention centers, again, back to that EPA data, that risk screening environmental indicators data set. And so what we found was that, or what I found was that Texas is disproportionately represented. 9 of the top 10 most polluted prison facilities and 4 of the top 5 most polluted ICE facilities are found in Texas. And you might think, well, that makes sense. Aren't most of the ICE facilities in Texas? Well, a lot of them are, but they're also ICE facilities all over the country. They're in Washington State, they're in New York City, they're all around. So this kind of really jumped out at me. So here's the top 10 most polluted federal prison facilities. And that toxicity percentile is these are the worst of the worst environments, I guess you could say. 98.86 toxicity percentile is very high. And you'll see Houston and Beaumont. And so what's going on in these areas? Well, there's also lots of oil and gas refining in these areas, lots of air pollution in Texas generally, but also where these sites are located. And then if we look at the ICE detention facilities, we see 4 of the top 5, all the top 6 in the Texas-Oklahoma area. So the important part when we think about these environmental indicators with incarcerated folks is that people that are in these environments are there 24/7 for the entirety of their sentence for their stay. So, unlike folks that are in the community that might live near a polluted site or work near a polluted site, these folks are being exposed 24/7, 365. There's no way for them to move away or escape those hazards. So that's what I've been doing. I would argue that more quantitative work needs to be done to correlate prison siting and these hazards. I think that even though I'm arguing for quantitative work, I also think qualitative studies, these case studies are really important to shed light on these issues. And I think we also need to continue monitoring how these dynamics play out as incarceration in the United States changes, evolves, and likely falls. We're seeing that it is a bipartisan issue nowadays to reduce the prison population for very different reasons. On one side, you might see it as more of an economic issue. On the other side, you might see it as more of a social justice issue. So I wanted to talk to you how I got through this long process. So I went from examining coal to examining prisons to now examining prisons at the national level to now examining ICE facilities. So to begin, the key theme for me to begin this was like, can we say that there is not an economic argument for the prison industry benefiting local communities? And we could say no. That's pretty clear. Prison locations generally are correlated with elevated pollution, and certain areas like Appalachia are seen as fit for housing these societies' waste or societal cast-offs. All right, so thank you all, and that's all I have. I'd be happy to open up this discussion and hear what you all are working on and what your thoughts are.
Great, yeah, awesome. Thank you so much. I really like how you framed this through the kind of paradigm of the development of your research. I was particularly struck by, like, in your early 2012 piece, how you talked about with the cost of coal on local economies and stuff, how you talked about finding that unemployment statistic and being like, oh no, and I think that it's something that I'm kind of grappling with as still in my infantile stages here in the poor PhD kind of realm. What do we do with findings that are conflicting or challenging and stuff? And so I really like how you emphasized that led you to new questions. And so I think that's really cool and helpful. I wanted to add kind of a thought that I had specifically when you brought up the notion of the toxicity of jails in particular. I've run into this in the criminology kind of canon writ large. Is there tends to be like a really from what I've seen, an overfocus on prisons. And I don't know why. It's like prisons are just kind of sexier or something like this, like to the imagination. And one thing that strikes me about jails is that in some places, like in locally, like at New River, there is a high amount of people who are incarcerated in jails who are either awaiting trial, or they're in there because of a violation. So like they failed a drug test or something like this. And I just think it's important to emphasize that up to half of these folks are not necessarily currently serving time because of a conviction. Some of them have not even been, have not even been arraigned yet or anything. And so years ago on the West Coast, I met a kid who was trying to get bail, for example, and he had been locked up for a little over a month because he borrowed, quote unquote, this was from his words, borrowed his girlfriend's EBT card and used it illegally, and he was in there on like credit card fraud charges, and completely destitute, poor, costing the county there, hundreds of dollars a day over this like $20 charge. You bought some chips and stuff at a local facility. And so you just hear these weird horror stories coming out of jails. So I wanted to kind of kick off the questions, and then if other people have questions, yeah, well, write them in the chat, and then maybe Brad, if you're able to kind of facilitate that. But I'll kick us off with one question that has been pressing on my mind recently, in light of the Hurricane Helene, is we've seen some reports coming out of North Carolina of inmates who are particularly, dispossessed by like being evacuated from facilities that had no water, no electricity, and in at least one case, 850 inmates with no food. So like this very like completely bleak, destitution, like no resources at all. And I've read some reports about previous environmental catastrophes and disasters, such as Katrina, where inmates drowned or were stuck in flooding facilities that were overflowing with refuse and sewage and stuff like this. And so I'm just curious if that's something that you've encountered within some of this data that you're looking at on environmental harms and the relationship between these harms and incarceration.
Well, that's a really important point. No, I haven't. I'm using these data sets that are available, and they have a limited amount. But these stories are compelling and tragic. One recently, not, I guess, yeah, I'm getting old. I think it was probably about 10 years ago. Elk River there's a chemical spill outside of Charleston, and it contaminated all the water supply in the region, and prisoners there were folks at the local jail were forced to use that water, and it was highly polluted from I think it was from chemicals that were used to clean coal, to get coals it doesn't come out all black and shiny. It comes with dirt and mud and debris attached. So they use chemicals to clean it, and so these folks were subjected to that. And they have no recourse, right? If you want the water, you got to drink it, and even though it's contaminated, but it just shows the devaluation of these folks generally. Though I think that would be fascinating research to link the disasters and hazards literature with the impacts on the incarcerated. I don't know off the top of my head if that's really if that's out there in the literature. That's not something that I really looked at. But those case studies would be incredibly compelling. Yeah, maybe that's something for you. We have a great disasters researcher in the sociology department, Lisa Ritchie. So I don't know. I know that there's some students that are interested in Asheville previous to this disaster. So I'm wondering if some of those folks might be able to, kind of, redirect some of their research to examine some of these impacts on different communities in Asheville and these affected areas. There's a question here. There is loads of literature that document the impacts of incarceration on life expectancy, but I don't think that there is any research that I'm familiar with that that isolates the effect of environmental exposure to pollution as a factor in reducing life expectancy. Those sorts of studies are very difficult just from the nature of the time. Obviously, people typically live a long time. Those kind of longitudinal studies are difficult, but I'm sure that it could be done, and I think that would be a fascinating study. But yeah, we do know that most folks that are incarcerated at some point in their lives live at least a decade less than most other folks who are not ever been inside of a cell. Anyone else? Anyone want to talk about their own research or anything else?
So I will ask a question here if no one else is going to. But you identify Appalachia as this place that is you referenced that its framing as a home to white trash allows these other things to happen in this space. Can you talk a little bit about how that initially happened? Was this, always a place that people housed their cast-offs, or was it something that was intentionally fostered by economic interest, or kind of how was this messaging, I suppose, originally started? Because theoretically, someone had to determine to call them white trash or however you want to frame it initially there, right?
Yeah, that's that might be a question for Shannon. I see Shannon's on here, but this kind of denigration goes back a long time. I think a lot of it was journalistic at the beginning. Appalachia, 100 and let's say 40 years ago was still um, quite exotic. It was the frontier, and a lot of the people that were there came from a different European lineage. They were Scots Irish, and there are already some stereotypes about the Scots Irish folks before they immigrated to the United States. And so the folks that chose to move to Appalachia were of a different sort, typically a little bit more independent and individualistic and perhaps rugged, you might say. And a lot of journalists in like the 1880s, 1870s, I think a lot of this happened following the Civil War. A lot of journalists came into the region and um, uh, wrote these sort of sensationalist accounts of what they saw, right? For someone from New York City to come to the middle of, Eastern Kentucky or something like that, they were sensational, right? They would, for every normal interaction they'd had, they would only, isolate the ones that were that they could sell magazines and newspapers. And so this idea of these people that were other, right? They were of America. They were in America, but not of America. There was something different about them, that they didn't uphold the middle class ideals that we see in the cities in the East Coast. There was all of these kind of exploitative accounts of feuds, right? The hillbilly feuds going back to the Hatfields and McCoys, and this idea that these folks were violent and clannish and ignorant, right? There was very little education. And so you got to think about the isolation in these hollers, 150 years ago. We think now if you've driven to West Virginia, you're going to lose cell phone coverage, and you're going to, we think about the hillbilly horror stuff of today. Well, that's based in what was happening at the time when these folks are riding around on horses trying to kind of cover these folks and explain these folks to the rest of the United States. These folks are very isolated. The education systems aren't there, and they're pretty rugged individualistic folk. And so a lot of that was really exploitable to the media. So I think it's been going on for at least 150, 160 years. There's some great books. Shapiro wrote one in the 70s about these other people, these other Americans, and how they're how this narrative of these people aren't like us. They
Can I
are,
add,
yeah. Oh yeah,
can I,
Shannon.
since you called me out, I'll take the invitation. Um, and just to add to that, there have been, these stereotypes have been used in a lot of different ways by a lot of different people. And so certainly the local color writers who were using that as a way to sell stories and sensationalize, but also these stereotypes were used in a very similar way as stereotypes about American Indians were used to displace people from the land. And so this happened in Shenandoah National Park. This happened in the coal mining regions, where people who were living on the land that the coal barons wanted access to, by stereotyping Central Appalachian people as barbaric and backward and ignorant hillbillies. Then that was a way to justify taking the land, and in many cases the land was outright stolen from people. And so it's just part of this long story of exploiting the land and the people in that region being thought of as less than worthy of that land and resources.
Yeah, that's much better said than what I was meandering about. I think that's very important to link that those narratives with economics, and I think Shannon says that very well. This land became very valuable very quickly, right? There was always a logging industry in the push to push indigenous people off the land, because just the land was very wealthy and natural resource. It was a great place to live. There was game, there was fresh water, there was minerals and trees. But with coal, became this demand from industry to, we've got to have that land. This is they call them the $1 billion coal fields. So they knew very quickly once the railroads came in that they would be able to make a windfall. And so they would use techniques like the broad form deed, where folks that were, uneducated on legal matters, they would come and say, hey, we're going to give you some free money here. We're going to give you money, and all you have to do is sign this paper. And we're not even going to, we don't want your land. We just, if someday maybe we might want to look underneath the land. And the problem with these broad form deeds is that they separated surface rights from subterranean rights. And the subterranean rights trumped the surface rights. So what that meant is that someone signed one of these deeds, even though they supposedly had access to ownership of their own land, the coal companies had access to what's underneath the land, and that trumped legally. So someone could wake up to having their orchard or their farm being decimated so that a coal company could come in and mine the land underneath the subterranean rights. So this whole sort of swindling of people in their land is tied into this denigration of saying, well, they're just ignorant hillbillies. It's not like they could they don't really know they don't really know how to make money off their land. It's no big deal. They'll go find some other shack to live in.
Yeah, one of the things that I really appreciate, Dr. Perdue, about the Trashing Appalachia article in particular is how you link the sort of historical and political economic accounts of this dispossession, right? Such as the literally stealing of land, to discursive formations, and the way that I'm kind of interpreting it is that these discourses can kind of be reactivated, and so it's like with the pillbilly analogy, or the horror images of hillbilly cannibals, and paddle faster because I hear banjos. Kind of these things can constantly get reactivated, and this might be a really hard question, and it's something that I'm unclear on and still kind of grappling with. And Dr. Bell, if you wanted to jump in on this too, I'd be interested as well. But I'm curious about a particular reactivation of this discourse that gets mobilized for kind of right wing, or even like neo-fascistic purposes. So we have like I'm thinking of like Vance's Hillbilly Elegy and stuff, where the this notion of the poor white drug-addled kind of undesirables paradoxically can uphold a certain kind of racism, such as like being like, oh well, the existence of poor whites, and this is not anything that you've written. This is kind of me riffing on this, but the existence of poor whites somehow justifies undermining other kinds of identities, right? Like, oh well, we need to get rid of DEI, and we need to and so on and so forth. And these are the kind of right-wing arguments that I'm hearing that are picking up on a certain kind of discursive articulation of the hillbilly model. So I don't know if you wanted to riff on that, or if you had some ideas about that.
It's a great point. I mean, like for instance, the state that is fully contained in Appalachia is West Virginia. And up until very recently, West Virginia was a Democratic state. It was a Democratic stronghold forever, right? Those Democrats supported the coal industry, but it was not a Republican state, and that dramatically changed about 15 years ago. So what's going on there, right? And so I think what you're hinting at is the lack of class consciousness, right? And so rather than uniting together for economic opportunities and to fight against these powers that are exploiting the area that would transcend race. Race creates a very nice bifurcation, a very nice dividing line to say, well, maybe things aren't going perfectly for us, but at least we're not this group, or at least we're not that group, right? And those differences and those racial divides are emphasized and supported by politicians that want to, and to keep people divided, right? To not have this kind of class consciousness. And I think that's a very important point. Shannon, do you want to add on to that? Or
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, actually. And I think what you were just saying is something that Elizabeth Catt talks about in her book, What You're Getting Wrong About Appalachia, um, where and so just to take kind of a step back from what Robert was talking about, I think another part of your question was about how the right is kind of mobilizing some of the themes in Hillbilly Elegy of like, oh, it's individual, faults that are causing, or deficient culture that causes the problems of Appalachia and poorness. But she, in her book, talks about how the poor white Appalachian trope is used as a way to discredit the links between structural racism and inequality. Like, as she says, like, why can't poor people get ahead? It's not racism or structural inequality caused by racism, is kind of the conservative argument. It's because if it were, then what would explain the realities of poor white people who are in Appalachia? And so this being and the poor white Appalachian trope also was used during the War on Poverty as a way to get to kind of deflect attention away from people of color in urban areas who were impoverished. Again, kind of structuralizing, that's not a term, but making it less about the structural causes of inequality and more about individual deficiencies or problematic cultures that make people poor. And that just fits in very nicely with some of the neoliberal ideologies of, just individual people are what matters, and they pull themselves up by the bootstraps and things like that. So, yeah.
yeah, I think we see a lot of that with the anti-immigration discourse as well. It's true that the folks in Appalachia, their incomes and have not kept up with larger parts of America. So they're saying, why are we being left behind? And to weaponize DEI, to weaponize immigration, and say these people are being pushed ahead. They're getting advantages that we don't have, and so that creates that, re-emphasizes and reifies that racial divide, right? Rather than getting this class consciousness like we're talking about, we're saying that, we can pick out these other folks that, they need to be held back, right? Because they're being pushed up, and that only emphasizes the racial divides of the communities.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think we have time for, one or two more questions if anybody else would like to jump in. Well, if not, I have a book worth of them to ask you. I love picking your brain. So we have in CCC, there's kind of two overarching themes and focus so one is that we engage with a lot of like diverse, including like we have a lot of international scholars with us even here today. And two, thinking about community engagement. And so for example, you mentioned early on when you were talking about like your research with MTR, mountaintop removal, how you were struck by the affinities of apparently disparate groups, right? Like church groups and, radical activists and so on. I'm curious if you have any thoughts or might expand on both of these facets, right? Like, so people working together across diversity, and like how might that be kind of fostered at the community level, and then also what kind of international kind of context might this work preclude or lead to?
Yeah, you're pushing you're pushing me. I like it. A lot of was it just to back up when I first started approaching this work, I really wanted to emphasize or focus on the um, international elements because the conditions in many places in for incarcerated folks around the world are really horrific. The problem is that it's almost impossible for me to find out what's actually going on in a lot of these settings. So I think there is some international work being done, and I think some of the uh, this work was driven by activists and advocates. So long before any published work on this in academic journals, this was being fought for by groups like Fighting Toxic Prisons, right? And so there's a lot of advocacy work being done by groups that are don't really care about the scholarship, right? They're a lot of it's driven by folks that are incarcerated as well, right? And so they're exposing what's going on inside the prison. So a lot of these, so like my work is mainly, where are these things, right? It's mainly geographic, but what's really important is to focus on the conditions inside prisons as well. A lot of the conditions inside the prisons are only available to those that are incarcerated. So they're talking about mold and contaminated water and sewage leaks and things of this nature and unhealthy food, obviously. So a lot of that work has to be connected and tied to the folks that are incarcerated and allow them to have a driving perspective on this work. It's hard to find uh, community and collaboration on some of these issues, I think, much more so than like mountaintop removal. Mountaintop removal really cuts across divides. So even if you're a right-wing person and a left-wing person, you could both, really be saddened and outraged by the decimation of the environment, right? If you're a local person, you're seeing what's going on in your community, that's something that's a little bit easier to make connections over, right? A lot of the denigration of incarcerated folks in our country is it's pretty widespread. Most folks really devalue folks that are incarcerated. They think that it's an individual problem, it's a you problem, it's something that you deserve. And so it's a little bit harder to find folks that are more understanding of the broader structural issues at play here that have led to this, the United States being the world's jailer, right? That we incarcerate more people than anywhere else on the earth. I think that there would definitely be a lot of religious folks that are interested in this, and I think that would be a great place to start. Liberation Catholics, for instance, or folks that are really interested in social justice issues, Unitarian Universalists. So you've got folks that have that kind of perspective. And it seems to me that it's mainly folks that have loved ones that are incarcerated, right? I think most Americans this is not on their radar. And, caring for the folks that are incarcerated is not really on our bingo card as Americans, right? They're out of sight, out of mind, and most of us have a very punitive stance on folks that are incarcerated. So it's difficult. It's a difficult, Shane. I think it's much more difficult than to unify over something that is so striking and horrifying as mountaintop removal. But I think, groups like yours, that's a very positive step forward. I will
Cool.
say,
Yeah, thank you.
I think we're gonna wrap up. I'll tell you a very, very short, interesting story before we go. I had a journalist from I think it was the Atlantic contact me a few years ago, and he was like, "There's this new report out by the DOJ and the Bureau of Prisons, and they cite your work in it. And I wanted to get your feedback on this." And I was like, "What? That's crazy." And so there's a prison in Letcher County that was proposed to be built as a $444 million dollar prison in Eastern Kentucky. And the community didn't want it. There's a huge resistance to building this prison in the area, and it had been supported by the Trump administration. The local legislator in charge was Hal Rogers. He'd been in Eastern Kentucky politics forever, and he was called the King of Pork. He was always bringing money back to his community. He was really good at it. So they were bringing in this $444 million prison into Eastern Kentucky. Long story short, Mitch McConnell, the Kentucky senator, pissed off Donald Trump. And so Donald Trump and his Bureau of Prisons decided that they did not want to fund this big prison because of their unhappy relationship. So they cited my work, which was published in the Journal of Appalachian Studies, to say that, look, these prisons don't bring in economic development to the region. So the reporter was like, I found it pretty strange that an article from Journal of Appalachian Studies was cited in this Donald Trump Bureau of Prisons, Department of Justice memo to cancel this prison. So sometimes your work can be used in ways that you don't anticipate. So I guess that's the punchline of that story. But I was happy that it was used to support the denial of that prison. But I want to thank you all for allowing me to speak with you today. It's been fun.